All right, let's get this started with a fantastic panel. This is incident response, state of play. And our first panelist I'd like to introduce is Jennifer Archie, a partner at Latham and Watkins, where she's worked for over 30 years. Also the editor of a global privacy and security compliance law blog, has spoken all over the world as a data privacy expert, and in fact is joining us from Hong Kong right now. Jennifer is a true pioneer both in the US and abroad in the area of privacy and data breach. Really honored and fortunate to have Jennifer join us today. Welcome, Jennifer.
Great to be here.
Next up is Chris Cwalina, the global co-head of Norton Rose Fulbright's Data Protection, Privacy, and Cybersecurity Group, who has unique experience handling complex cybersecurity attack and data breach investigations. Chris began his career in privacy as VP and Assistant General Counsel at ChoicePoint, where he ran the company's privacy, compliance, ethics, and credentialing department. He also worked in-house at Dow Chemical and at Bayer. Thrilled to have Chris here to share his perspective. Welcome, Chris.
Great to be here, Bruce. Thank you.
Next up, let me introduce Luke Dembosky, co-chair of the Cybersecurity and Data Privacy Practice at Debevoise, and a former Deputy Assistant Attorney General at DOJ National Security Division, where he oversaw all the national security cyber cases. This included the DOJ's response to the breaches at Target, Sony, Home Depot, Anthem, and OPM. Also, the Deputy Chief of Litigation for the DOJ CCIPS, the Computer Crime and Intellectual Property Section, where he supervised all cybersecurity and intellectual crime prosecutions, and was selected in 2020 to serve as member of the New York Cybersecurity Advisory Board. Welcome, Luke.
Thank you, Bruce.
Next up, a unique speaker we have here today, Jamil Farshchi. He is the current CISO of Equifax, where he manages what must be one of the most extraordinarily interesting and challenging jobs in the field. Before that, Jamil was CISO at Home Depot, Time Warner, and the Los Alamos National Laboratory, as well as Vice President of Global Information Security at Visa. On top of all that, Jamil is also a strategic engagement advisor for the FBI. Welcome, Jamil.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Finally, let me introduce Evan Roberts, a senior managing director in the strategic communications segment at FTI and co-head of the cybersecurity and data privacy communications group there. Evan is advised on a multitude of interesting projects. He advised an energy company deemed critical infrastructure through a devastating ransomware attack that temporarily shut down a pipeline, providing nearly half of all the fuel to the East Coast in the U.S., counseled a large insurance provider through an unprecedented ransomware attack and an associated network disruption, and many, probably hundreds of other incidents like that. Thrilled to have Evan here today. Welcome, Evan.
Thank you, Bruce. Great to be here.
All right, great way to start today. Let me turn it over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Bruce. Really appreciate it. So great to have everybody join us. We have an amazing panel today. We have some of the, as you just heard, best operators in the IR space from a comms, legal, and in-house perspective for sure. So we're going to try to set the state of play and give an overview really of three topics we're going to try to talk about. We're going to talk about threat actor landscape, the regulatory environment, as well as get in the weeds a little bit on IR program developments, and talk about just what we're seeing right now, and hopefully tee up sort of for more detailed discussion later throughout the day. So the way to start regarding threat actor landscape, we've seen public information indicating that ransomware cases and percentages of companies that pay ransom are declining, and we've seen a lot of comments about the successes in that regard, and those comments made by government officials are true, to be sure. But on the ground, for the folks here, it seems like anything but things slowing down. It seems like we're all as busy as ever. So first, Luke, ask you to comment about what you're seeing in your practice and how busy you guys are and what you're seeing. So Luke, why don't you start and then we'll go around the horn.
Thanks, Chris. Well, job security, I'm here to say, in cyber is pretty good. I think we're all on this call, and many of our colleagues who aren't are very busy these days. We did see a little bit of a tapering on ransom encryption cases last year. It seems that things have heated back up in the last couple of months. Where we saw a lot of growth was on data extortion cases that did not involve encryption. So rewinding, say, 3 or 4 years, we were dealing with large monolithic groups. Maze handed off to Conti and others. And so it was one-stop shopping. You knew which, quote, organized crime group you were dealing with. Now things have stratified and fragmented a lot on the attacker side. We have the whole market of access brokers. We have people handling the data storage. So these groups have developed their own ecosystem and market. They've also changed members, and groups have come and gone and consolidated. And some of that's to the credit of the U.S. government and others that have brought some sanctions. Cases had some successes. Post-colonial, it was clear that the U.S. declared that its national security resources would be brought to bear. So that's an example. The data extortion thing is interesting, and for our clients is probably a bigger threat. Like, a lot of our clients are highly sophisticated. They've got immutable backups. They've got strong BCP and DR. And while they don't take that for granted, a smash and grab data extortion combined with really aggressive harassment tactics, from threat to post data to calling executives and customers, mining the data, that is probably a bigger threat for most. And that's the piece that we see rising quickly. In terms of the nation state side, much is the same. We do see more activity from North Korea and Iran and some places. So it's a broader range of actors, more of them for commercial purposes. We all remember North Korea's attack on Sony, which was all about destruction. Well, now it's all about raising funds for the regime through raiding crypto wallets and doing some ransomware and similar things. So those are sort of the big picture trends. One last note is we see threat actors paying a lot of attention to what they can mine in terms of public data and data that they've stolen. So you announce a big M&A transaction, or there's a deal where they know there's going to be capital calls. We see them going to their brokers, trying to insinuate themselves into those communications, divert wires, or time an extortion attack before signing or closing. We've had that in a number of our deals where it was too much to be a coincidence. We're also seeing people take all these troves of data that are being taken in ransom and extortion cases and mine them for follow-on phishing. So we're seeing old copies of emails doctored up and renewed so that they're more tailored and effective when they're sent to, say, the word processing department or somebody in marketing. It's much more compelling because they've got this resource of data and better tools to mine it. I'll stop there. There's a lot others could say as well.
No, it's good. That's a great overview, consistent with what I think we're all seeing, which is quite busy times for us. Jennifer, not a lot of free time on your hands, I assume.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely, very consistent picture there. And I think the macro trends are interesting, but I always think, what would you do something different next by reason of the macro trends if you were Jamil at a company or something, and you're really still only ramping up defenses, only ramping up sophistication because the regulatory expectations are going up and up and up, and the trend doesn't matter that much if you're the one that got attacked. I definitely see as the disruption through encryption is less disruptive due to these redundant measures, that there's a lot more creativity and just sort of surprises about what the capabilities and of the threat actor team is to mine the data and just create more mischief so that they can find a better way to apply pressure than just saying, I have your data, I'm going to dump it. Like the way they show you what they have, the way they think of what's important, and what might apply pressure. So I think that the extortion threat is the thing that's most dynamic for me. Like it used to be a very tried and true and familiar way in which the extortion would kind of present itself and the pressure would and now you can get surprises, certainly DDoS attacks and just any way to pressure the organization, and it feels more and more bespoke rather than just sort of a commodity playbook of how do you apply a pressure. So I think just a lot of sophistication around what have we got in this data set that we can make use of that will either force the best play for them, which is ransom payment, or the second best, which is actually selling it and doing a lot of things with it downstream. I think I used to feel like it didn't always get used. You could tell your client they certainly can or might, but now it seems more predictable that if they're going to find the sweet spots in that data set and monetize it or do other things with it.
Jamil, you're on the front lines. So what are you and your team seeing?
Well, we're definitely not seeing a slowdown. That'd be fantastic if we did. And I think per Luke's comment, we did see a bit of a slowdown last year at the beginning Q1. It was a nice relief, and but I think it was around the end of Q2, early Q3, it picked back up again, and it sort of picked back up right where it left off, I think, before. And while this is anecdotal, I see it across every spectrum. And so, I get calls and texts from other CISOs consistently. There was 3 last week alone that were dealing with their own ransomware events. We have a breach services function here at Equifax. So we're the ones who come in and notify victims of these attacks after the fact, and consumer victims of these things. And there's been a huge uptick in that space recently. So from that angle, it looks like it's not slowing down at all. And quite frankly, when I look at it, if I'm an attacker, why not? It's a pretty lucrative endeavor for them. You're making, several $1 million a pop, upwards of 50, 60 million in certain cases. And it's easy. I think a lot of organizations, despite some of the stuff we heard a minute ago, they aren't prepared. And these attacks typically aren't all that sophisticated. They're compromising and exploiting pretty basic things, patching, or, I don't have a certificate updated or whatever it might be. They're pretty basic things. And so it's lucrative, it's easy. And we aren't doing enough, I think, on our side collectively to be able to protect it. So I don't see the trend slowing down. I think the government's done some good things in terms of helping to turn the screws a little bit, and add a little bit more pain and risk to the attacks. But look, we've got a long way to go, and I don't really see the end of this anytime soon.
Well, we all get asked that a lot, right? What do we see, and do we think that things are going to get better? And I always say, no, I tend to be skeptical a bit, to be sure. I think we all are a little bit, given what we do for a living. But my view of the future is it's just going to get worse. I know that's a really encouraging note for an early morning. But your point about the ease of it. For the most part, and you couple that with the increased sophistication on the other hand, and then you couple that with the nature of the beast, which is the environment and supply chain tax, and it's just a challenging space. And I think even with the development of AI, et cetera, it's just going to continue to get more challenging for the folks in this field. I think one encouraging note is for everybody on this call and folks that are in the IR space, regardless of whether you're in-house working for a company, the government, whether you're in the legal side, comm side, plenty of job opportunity, right? I know for a fact that Jennifer, Luke, and I are all trying to hire, and it is a difficult thing for us to do, to find folks. I think everybody in this field is in that space. So that's one encouraging note. So moving to one of the hardest things I think Jennifer, Luke, myself, Jamil deal with in helping companies respond to incidents is internal and external communications. Yesterday, there was actually a House Oversight Committee hearing about a data breach. Pretty live bench, relatively aggressive in their views and questioning, but notable. Their one positive comment, or one of their main positive comments, was the response. How good the response was after the incident, and the communications around that. FTI happened to be involved in that case. Evan, comment on that. I mean, what is your, we've all worked with you over the years. Approaches change and shift. What are you guys doing? What are you doing differently?
It's a really good question, Chris. And I do think there's been kind of a fascinating change in the environment as far as expectations and the response when an organization that experiences any sort of incident, but put ransomware top of the list. Rewind the clock a couple of years, and a lot of the questions are, oh my God, how could you let this happen, right? And if you, to Jamil's point, had the barn door wide open, unpatched software, you're still going to get that question. But far more often, we see our clients or organizations we're working with, they report to a business customer, hey, we've got this incident, here's what we're doing in response. And so often now we get back, oh, I'm really sorry that happened to us last year. Keep us posted. And so the expectation has shifted more from you must never let an incident like this happen to being graded on what your response is. And some very basic things that we've seen change, over the past couple of years. A lot of organizations are really hesitant if it's a ransomware incident to say ransomware. And they'll start by saying we're experiencing a technical disruption. And then they'll say it's a security incident. And then data will get posted on a shame site, and then they'll eventually admit that it's ransomware. And companies get killed for doing that now. The media is having a field day with insert victim company finally admits that it's ransomware. And we have found that because people now understand this world a lot better, it's far better in almost every case to just rip the Band-Aid off and say, hey guys, we're experiencing a ransomware attack. Here's what we're doing in response. Because the market is much more conditioned to understand what that means and what they should expect moving forward, rather than this nebulous, like, oh yeah, a technician tripped and spilled coffee on a server somewhere and we're down, and then, oh yeah, no, it's a security incident, and kind of slow playing that. So really, you want to be transparent without overextending yourself and making definitive statements that you can't defend down the line. But really, the more we find that our clients are communicative, are willing to answer questions, are willing to get on the phone with their customers, the better the response is. And so, Chris, to the point you were making about this recent case, the more you can just sort of be upfront as far as what you know early on, and be less in that defensive sort of classic crisis communications bunker mentality, it really doesn't work. Because the flip side of people understanding these incidents and the flip side of people knowing what ransomware means is that they're very well conditioned for the 20 questions that they're going to want to ask you right at the onset. And if you try to hide or shy away from those, you really sort of start to degrade your reputation early on. So we find that a much more front-footed communications posture early in the incident, and a ability to stick to the line of, we may not know the answer to that right now, but when we do, we will let you know, is really additive to the way a given organization's stakeholders perceive the response process. The sort of sophistication has gone up, and that has just added expectations from a communication standpoint for transparency and information sharing. I mean, all the way down to the tactical, like, yes, we're going to be sharing IOCs, things that you can do to use your incident as a way to help other organizations become more secure. Those expectations have just ramped up.
Look, I think everybody on this panel would agree. I mean, the open and transparent strategy, I think, is critical these days. Speaking of open and transparent, I neglected to mention, if there are, we will take questions from anyone. So fire away at this panel, and I will try to address those questions. So you can put them in chat, and I'll try to address those. Before we move to the next topic, the reg environment, I do want to double click a little bit on some of the things that were just said. Luke, I'll come to you first, just in terms of how we're seeing right now the threat actors evolve. And you touched on this a bit, but I just want each of you all to comment sort of the tactics, the specific tactics that we're seeing, more aggressive extortion tactics or retaliation, reliability of the threat actors, anything that you want to hit on. How are you seeing these tactics that the threat actors are employing evolve?
Sure. So at the top of the food chain, the major groups are predominantly in the Russian-speaking world, and with them, it's still by and large pretty transactional. So they're pretty reliable track record of giving you what that you've asked for, and there may be there's certainly data posting, quote, shaming, but they haven't been as aggressive as we've seen from a substrata of other groups. These are the smash and grab type things that I referred to earlier. There we've seen some really aggressive and personal harassment campaigns, calling executives, family members, including children who were in the contact list, calling children's schools, calling customers, certainly. There are a couple reports of swatting, but that still hasn't risen to a common thing. That's still quite fringe. And tying back to what Evan was saying, this puts tremendous pressure on your communication strategy, because it's hard enough to figure out when to come out and tell people about data theft or operational disruption, but when do you start warning customers that they could be receiving harassing calls? Your employees could face this. When do you give swatting guidance, which is a big deal and scares people? It makes it far thornier to deal with those types of situations. That's the primary really aggressive tactic that we're seeing, is heightened harassment of stakeholders.
Yeah, no, I think we're all feeling that. Jennifer, how about you? What are you seeing?
Yeah, I think the same. I may mention some of it before, but causing pain and disruption, and say a lot of these smash and grabs, the data they get is often HR, finance, accounting, shared drives that are, more exposed than, maybe crown jewel customer databases or something. And, looking for ways to just be disruptive with the workforce, and whether it's, IRS, tax season or something, but like finding the pockets of data in there that can, apply, more pressure, or really just show revenge and retaliation. I think one thing I wanted to say about these tactics and things that Luke mentions is just the criticality of making data-driven decisions, and thinking as, business executives or lawyers, are in the room at the company having to make decisions, thinking in kind of a business judgment rule mentality, because there is intelligence. There is data that you can get. What have we seen with this group before? What do others know? And making sure you're not deciding in the blind, because you just want to have all the information that that you can have. It's really the only way to make your best, most informed, defensible decision, is to think what did other people disclose? And when they didn't disclose, what did the threat actor do? Or all these things. And there are so many good sources for, getting aggregated insights on, some of these, different threats and tactics, because there's an awful lot of groups, and they don't always follow the exact same patterns. And you might react tactically differently, dependent on the intelligence you get about what the experience is.
Jamil, how are you thinking about this environment, and obviously prevention is sort of a thing, obviously. But to your earlier point, I mean, are you? I guess I have two questions for you. Are you, where are you really devoting your time and resources? Would that be on detection and response, for example? And then also add to that what Luke was talking about earlier, which is, now folks are trying to just get data, and steal it. So that gets into a whole information governance, data governance aspect of things too. I know that's sort of another side of the fence, but how are you thinking about these threat actors and where are you focusing your efforts?
It's
I think
interesting.
that- you go ahead.
No, please.
Go ahead, Jamil. Yeah, no, you go ahead.
I think earlier this year, it was February. I was a co-chair for a committee with the Bipartisan Policy Center, and what we did is we put together a report on the top risks in cybersecurity, and we all went into this thing. It was several top tier CISOs, sitting, congressmen, just a couple of state AGs and stuff like that. They're in this committee. And when we went into it, we all thought that it was going to be, we were going to come up with these next gen threats, and there was going to be all of this unique stuff coming in. And you know what netted out of it? None of that stuff. It was common vulnerabilities. It was preparation for events. It was training the workforce, prioritization and communication with the board and leadership. It was those things, the same things that we've all dealt with for the last, I don't know, at least last decade, I think. And that was the key takeaway, that we really just have not, as an industry, progressed that much. Like we've been talking about the same things for a long time. And so to answer your question, Chris, I'm really focused on the basic things. So, I can't say that, look, I'm overemphasizing detection and response relative to the preventative controls or just the overall preparation. What I think is a good day is a day where we have meaningful visibility around the assets within my environment, and that we know that we've done all that we can to be able to remediate the key gaps that we know about, and that we've put in some good compensating measures on the front end to give us a little bit more wiggle room to be able to defend against the bad guys.
Oh, great. Well, Jennifer, well said. Jennifer, did you have something you wanted to add there?
No, I misheard you before.
Oh, no worries at all. So good conversation so far. And Jamil, I do want to get to in a minute sort of the root cause discussion. But before we do that, regulatory environment. I mentioned Congress attention. They've been focused on these issues for some time, as have a lot of government regulatory bodies. Luke, lots of stuff going on, and we don't have nearly enough time to talk about it all. But SEC, what would you like to highlight that you see as a notable development in this space?
Yeah, for SEC and others. So on the privacy side, certainly that drumbeat continues, even from before GDPR. On the cyber side, arguably the industry leader, even if you're not regulated by them, has been the NYDFS. So a lot of people paid close attention to that as perhaps the first comprehensive cyber regulation, certainly in the US. And that is now had a second iteration just published, and it's in the in-between phase before it's effective. The SEC tracks a lot of the same things. The trend lines are really putting pressure on boards and senior management to engage, be accountable, be certifying things, be briefed in terms of board expertise, a disclosure requirement from the SEC. It's not a board expertise requirement, to be clear, but it's basically putting pressure on there to be board expertise through the disclosure side of that. SEC has published rules not only for public companies, but for registered investment advisors and funds with tight reporting timeframes. For the public companies, it's 48, it's 4 business days. You have to disclose quite a bit. Now, this is not final. We're expecting at any time now their final rules to come out. But what it's going to require in a nutshell, and then I'll pause because I know we're short on time, is it's going to really require a combination of information security, legal, and communications to be very tightly in sync, to be able to get the information out and analyze it for materiality quickly and have that then reflected in whatever your communications are, so you're not getting yourself in trouble from a trading standpoint. So workflows have to be developed to get the information up and out for evaluation quickly. Legal has to have a materiality matrix that they're cross-checking significant updates against. There has to be documentation of that process. And then communications has to understand how to make adjustments in coordination with legal on what we can say in the public statement, the 8K versus a sidebar. Do we do an 8K? Tons of disclosure requirements, steady state, incident requirements, tighter timeframes, and senior management engagement are really the big picture themes.
No, agree with all of the above, Luke. Jennifer, how about you? Any developments notable? FTC?
Yeah, I was just going to speak to the enforcement climate, where obviously the FTC's been at, they must be up over 80, 90, 100 data security orders, and we got seen them ramping up in intensity and detail and expectations for the companies. But the FTC, I think, still feels that there's not enough sit up and take notice outcomes out there to really be affecting behavior in the real world. And so last year we saw that in one matter for the company was Drizzly, the data breach itself didn't even really involve sensitive data, like the kind of things we're used to doing state data breach reporting around. There hadn't been any real active mismanagement alleged. It was mostly about omissions, and the FTC was very determined that an individual should be made individually liable in this for future injunctive relief for employment at other organizations. So not just having a CEO accountable for the company that experienced the breach, but that for 10 years thereafter, if a certain trigger was met, the kind of information security program that, breached company number one it was going to have to follow this executive to future jobs. And I think it's just a sign of their frustration that it's very well established what a reasonable program should have by way of elements, and that it's not getting executed on. And so when they, saw an example where they felt more attention should have been paid, they look to do that. And so I think that was a surprising direction, consistent with some other enforcement themes they have there around individual liability. And we certainly, I would say, they're cousins in the state AG's, offices. I think most of us on this call would be familiar with the most active AG offices, and we haven't seen them going after individuals, but we certainly see them being very diligent and working up each and every breach and trying to, understand if there was, negligent or something, that where they really want to slap an order down or use their superior ability to get monetary fines.
Evan, in this increased regulatory environment that we're seeing, again, SEC attention, public filing attention, you mentioned open and transparent. You talked about that. With who? Customers, regulators, business partners, the public. What are you actually saying specifically?
It's a good question, Chris. And the one piece where you may be pushed into communicating more broadly, but we actually see probably the least amount of pressure is broadly with the public. The term breach fatigue gets thrown around a lot, but it is real. It's real with press. It's real with end consumers. Everybody's gotten a notice at this point. Typically, we see with sort of public attention, media attention, either needs to be an interesting brand, it needs to be a highly disruptive incident, or there needs to be some other hook. But for every other audience, we are always pushing for transparency. There's generally sort of a default position is, well, this doesn't affect our vendors at all, so why would we communicate with them? Well, I'll tell you why, because eventually they're going to notice that something's going on and they're going to come ask you. And it puts a company on the back foot if they're having to be reactive to questions they're getting and they've provided no information at the outset. So customers, regulators, business partners, even if they're not impacted, a heads up to let them know what's going on and what you're doing in response is always more well received than their, data privacy officer hearing about this from somebody else in the ecosystem and coming and calling and saying, what's going on? Why didn't you give me a heads up? And so it's tempting to think about, oh, this is this subsidiary of our business, so we probably only need to talk to people who deal with that. And it's important to recognize that this information flows within this, security community pretty freely. I mean, Jamil mentioned, right? A couple of CISOs have called me or texted me in the last week asking specific questions. And so you really ought to think about stakeholders pretty holistically and think about, if you can tell somebody, hey, you don't have to worry about this. This doesn't affect the part of our business that interacts with you. Tell them that early. Don't wait for them to come ask you that question, because if you go proactive, you may be able to head off some of the common questions. But I promise if they have to come knocking at your door, they're coming with that 25-question security questionnaire because that's their default response. So we often think about sort of who's impacted as the audiences we need to communicate with, but it would be to the detriment to not also think about who can we take out of this box and who can we give a reassuring message to early to head off some of that stampede to the front door of questions and questionnaires, et cetera.
We have to tell Bruce that we're going to need to add another 30 minutes to this panel. We've got about 10 minutes. We could talk for a long time, and there are questions coming in. There's no way we're going to get to all of them. Jamil, I want to turn to you because in this increased regulatory environment that we're seeing and the attention the boards are putting to cybersecurity, one of the things that we see often in our practices is difficulties that the CISOs experience with communicating to the board. On the one hand, they need to exude confidence and talk about the strength of their program to the boards. On the other hand, they have to convey where real risk lies so that the boards are adequately informed, and that's going to become more and more important as we go. We see CISOs struggle with this immensely, whether it's before, during, or after an incident. This is something I happen to know you do really well. What do you say about that, and how do you think about communicating up in this environment?
Well, first off, I think what point Jennifer made was fantastic. And I think it hits the nail on the head, which is that regulators, they're frustrated. I mean, they're frustrated that after all of these years of encouraging organizations to do the right thing, they just haven't seen the progress. And so that's why I think we're getting so prescriptive as it relates to some of these regs. I personally, though, I don't think when I look at the SEC guidance proposal or NYDFS, it's not a huge bar. Like if you read it, if you just took it all into account based on all of the narratives and all the media stuff out there, it's the end of the world. Like everything is going to change and it's going to be so difficult to be able to comply. It's really not that hard. And yeah, at Equifax, we've invested a ton of money over the last several years to put ourselves in a leadership position here. But look, the stuff that we've already done, we're already largely compliant with these new things. And those were not difficult components of what we did. Going back to your question around communication, it is hands down, in my opinion, the number one thing that CISOs need to improve on. I would argue that, you can have the best technical expertise in the entire world, and you can have all the resources in the entire world. If you're unable to be able to effectively articulate the current posture of your organization, the risk posture of it, and be able to drive home the messaging around what is your strategy? What do we actually need to be able to accomplish? What are those threats? There's no way you're going to ever be able to build a successful program. And we see it time and again. I mean, I get board decks from some of my peers, and I get content from my own teams. And some of it I don't even understand. I'm like, what are you talking about here? And so if we're going to be able to bridge this divide, if we're going to be able to get the support from board members, from our executive teams, to be able to do some of these basic things that we've struggled with for so long, we've got to be able to communicate it in an effective way, in a way that's going to resonate with them. And I would take it a step further, because it's not just the board, it's not just the executive and the C-suite and things like that. It's also our own teams. Security is unique in the sense that we don't control our own fate. Not only do the threat actors do whatever the heck they want, we have to just be ready for it. But in addition to that, we oftentimes don't fully control the implementation of our controls themselves. Like, we have to leverage technology. We have to leverage the CFO. We have to leverage our GCs. We have to get this large body of individuals and teams to work together in an aligned fashion to be able to successfully manage the risk of our organizations. Yet over and over again, we get stuck in the technical weeds, and no one understands what we're talking about.
Let me jump in on that. By the way, this should be an entire session for sure, and we should do it next time. But let me just hit that right there, because I call it sort of the white noise syndrome. You've got boards who know to the nth degree every risk of the organization that they sit on, and when it comes to cybersecurity, by and large, I'm speaking generally, they haven't a clue. And it's what I think is part of it is that the CISOs that are reporting to them are putting up the grids with the yellow and the red and the vulnerability management stats and the asset management stats, et cetera. And it all goes out. What they leave those meetings with is, okay, well, we've got people who are all over this, so we're good. So when you say that, I really think that's important what you said about getting too technical, because and going back to your point about communication. So how do you then, what are you doing specifically to inform your board? Hey, yeah, we've got a really good program, but we've also got lots of real risk, and here's where that risk lies. I mean, how are you doing that specifically? And I know this is going to be that's a hard question, probably in 5 minutes, but what are you actually communicating when you're there?
A few things. First, to one of your points there, it's funny. I was just in a meeting with a CEO the other day who's talking about, he's on a board. He was talking about his CISO over at that organization. And he said, Jamil, the problem I have is that everything is always sunshine and rainbows with this guy. Like, he's always saying everything is perfect, yet I know that things are not. Like, what are the actual issues? So confidence is great for CISOs, but don't overdo it. Like, you've got to be able to your point, you got to be able to articulate what the risks are. Things aren't always rosy. Like, we do always have challenges there. For me, in terms of communication, I try to make it as simple as possible. I break down what those fundamental risks are. I use our control framework, the same thing that we use with our regulators, to be able to drive that dialogue, so I can have one single way to be able to discuss this. The other thing that I think is critically important, Chris, is helping to teach them. Like, this is a two-way road. Like, we CISOs, we always get thrown under the bus that, hey, we're terrible communicators. And oftentimes we are. But at the same time, it's really difficult to be able to explain a very deep, complex topic like cyber to an audience that literally has no technical expertise at all. And so I think it needs to go both ways. And so what I try to do is I use every meeting, every board meeting, every quarter, every month, whatever it is, to be able to help teach them a little bit about cybersecurity. You start with something basic like phishing, and you expand out to, access controls and whatever it might be. And so over time, you end up getting a board that fundamentally, at least at a high level, understands what security is about, understands what we're trying to do. And I think if you take that one step at a time kind of approach, it really goes a long way towards building the confidence, coupled with an understanding and appreciation for what you're trying to do day in and day out.
Well, since this is such a complex environment and an interesting topic, I'm going to stick with it, and I'm going to go around the horn and get, Evan, your perspective on this and how you're advising CISOs to communicate, because after all, I do believe you're a communication specialist. And then we'll go to Jennifer and Luke to get their input on this topic as well. And I believe that'll take us to the end. And I wish we did have more time. But Evan, over to you.
Yeah, I think I'd say a couple of things here, Chris. One is the flip side of the sort of concept that Jamil identified, the overconfident CISO, or the one who says everything's fine all the time. We actually did a piece of research last year of a number of CISOs representing organizations with billions and billions and billions of dollars of market capitalization. Well over half said that they felt pressure to make things sound better to their boards than they actually are. So I don't want to just put it on the CISO function. The CISO is a cowboy that decides, like, everything's fine. Pressure is coming from other functions too. And so I think it becomes not just a board communication exercise, but a C-suite and executive communications exercise to get them all on the same page that we have to be real with our board of directors and we have to be willing to talk about the risks. And interestingly enough, in that survey, the function that they struggled to communicate with most was the office of the CFO, which is not shocking, but also sort of highlights the tension between security and particularly if security is part of the IT function. IT is very often where companies go first for cost savings when the market is struggling. But as far as communicating, it's actually kind of interesting you raise this, Chris. We actually at FTI launched a dedicated CISO communications training program off the back of that research for just that reason. We call it Secure Your Seat to be catchy. It's about like your seat in the boardroom, in the executive room, but really because we know that there is a gap here. And not every CISO can communicate as effectively as Jamil can. And just in the same way as everybody in my industry has historically trained CEOs and general counsels to speak publicly or engage with their peers, CISOs have been neglected in that category. But our goal is to create something that can do for them what a traditional media trainer has been doing for a Fortune 500 CEO for the last 40 years. So,
well, I
can't, and we're working to try to meet it.
I can't tell you how many times I've had conversations with companies that tell me how great their cybersecurity programs are, and I usually end those conversations pretty fast because I don't have time for that. What I need to understand is where your risks and gaps are, and you need to be open and transparent about that because they know, and if they don't know, that's a problem, right? And if they think their cybersecurity programs are great, then that's an even bigger problem. Jennifer, I'm going to go to you, and then we'll close with Luke. What's your view on this topic?
Yeah, I'll try to do 20 seconds. So I'd say it's very trite to say don't let a good crisis go to waste. So every time there's an incident, we're, I think, a little bit bespoke to whatever's going on and saying we're not going to let this root cause analysis thing kind of linger around down in the engineering function. It's going to be brought in. And so you have independent forensic advisors right there, and they're making real-time observations and recommendations. And we make sure that the incident is told as a story to the board. This happened. Had you had these two layers, that would have protected you from that event. Then this happened, and like marching through the timeline and in making the observations about what was missing in the tech stack, what was missing in the people, what other, what specific layers would have done something, because all humans learn better through story. And, it gets the board to really learn fast and appropriate, change the mix of, headcount, resources, dollars and things, and do urgent things quickly.
Well, Luke, no pressure. You get to close us out. What say you?
Yeah, those are tough acts to follow. I agree with all of them. So we're trying to get boards directly involved in tabletops. And I know the regulators love that. So we'll take a tabletop and do a little vignette or breakout where we walk to another room and members of the board are on there to get briefed and work on their role. And they get a chance to practice a lot of the things that we're talking about. The other thing that we find helpful is when the CISO or others bring in examples of incidents that have hit others in the sector. How would we react? How would we have done it? So do a hot wash even when it's not your own incident. Just convene people. It's amazing in the Zoom and Teams world how easy it is to pop on, capture some lessons and say, how would we do? Also, I view this as like parenting teenagers. If you're not hearing anything bad, if it's all rainbows and unicorns, you're not getting the full story. So we often get boards say everything seems to be just so great. There's no problems here. That can't be true. You should insist on fronting what the challenges are. And if the CISO is a big picture thinker, they will appreciate having disclosed that and having joint ownership of the challenge and problem.
And I think that goes to the root of the problem that I think this panel all agrees on. Bruce, I got to about 1/3 of the topics I wanted to hit, so apologies for that. But this was a great panel, great discussion. So Bruce, over to you.
Thank you, Chris. Luke, Evan, Jennifer, Jamil, thanks so much for getting us off to such a great start today. Chris, given that we had about 30 questions, I think you did a pretty good job of getting through as much as you did.